That's it, and we're live for our schema beyond Google and back. As we can see, we give a few minutes for a few people. There's already a lot of people in the chat already from all over the world, Ohio. So if you're in the chat, let us know where you're from, and you know what I mean, we're going to dig into this, and I mean, we're going to take it that you already have a basic understanding of schema and structured data and the basics of the nuts and bolts there. So Houston, Delhi, India, San Francisco, Switzerland, Atlanta, Portland. Yeah, so we've got quite a few. So I'm pleased to be on this webinar, joined by two Jedis of schema, as I always call you two, Jono and Berkel. I would introduce you, but I'm sure you'll do a much better job than what I would do. So we get started. I'll let you introduce yourself. I'll let you go first, Martha. Ladies first.
Sure. So my name is Martha Van Berkel. I'm the CEO at Schema App, and I'm Canadian. So if you hear me say A, don't kind of hold it against me. And I'm just really delighted here to be able to talk a little bit about some advanced schema markup tactics.
That's nice. Jono.
Hi, I'm Jono. I run special ops at Yoast. I don't know what that means either, but I spend a lot of my time thinking about and specking up clever things to do with schema. And I'm an SEO and technical digital marketing nerd.
And so yes, more and more people joining. We've got quite a few people in the chat now, so don't see no reason to wait around and let people join. Let's get this show on the road. So obviously we're going to take it that people have a general understanding of what structured data is and what schema.org is. So I believe you've got something to share with us, Jono. I believe it is going first.
Yeah, should we set the scene a little bit first, Martha?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're super excited that, like, I would say finally it's the year of schema markup. Like Jono, you were just joking, like 2011, we're like right behind you, 2013. Like we've been doing this for such a long time. And, I guess like what I was super excited about was that we've seen like for the first time schema markup and structured data hit on like the SEO top things to do in 2020. And that came across the journals. And then I think the other observation is that, we saw, or like we've seen in the last 5 months, more releases of schema.org than we saw in all of 2019. And, so in addition to sort of, I'll say like market readiness and like people being aware that it's really important, we're also seeing, the founders and the collaborators within schema.org respond to that by continuing to invest in it on their side.
Yeah, it's so exciting. For so long, there's been a bit of a chicken and egg problem that nobody really adopted schema because it was hard to do and complex, and the rewards weren't that great. So Google and schema.org and the people around it didn't really involve in accelerating it, and it just needed to hit that tipping point. And we are so far past that tipping point now. Like, structured data is a primary citizen of all SEO conversations and not just this kind of awkward technical thing. And it's increasingly becoming the main way that we describe our products, our websites, our services. Yeah, this is an exciting time.
That's it. Yeah, and I know I've noticed that schema.org's been updated virtually every month since about April of last year. And yeah, John Mueller obviously turned around earlier on this year and said it's going to be getting more complex and there's going to be more changes coming. So yeah, it's definitely a hot topic and something that's been needed some attention for some time, should I say.
Definitely.
Absolutely. And I think especially with, what we're going to cover today, we're going to see how you can think of it as a core strategy across any type of business and any type of content, and why sort of it's more than just about getting features and rich snippets, but really about kind of understanding and sort of that underlaying kind of piece of how things are connected. So Jono and I are like, we're speaking our language. So to me, that's finally, I would say people have an appetite to learn that piece of it versus just, I call it like feature hunting, right? Like they're just trying to get, do the minimum to get that rich result.
That's it. Yeah, there's much more information that can be sent via structured data using schema.org than just what Google's looking for, and that's obviously what we're going to dig into here a little bit to give people that little bit of extra depth to their schema there. So
yeah, let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. Ready, Jono?
All right, let's go. Yeah. So we're gonna do a triple speed run through about 15 minutes or so of some of my rambling thoughts, and then pass over to Martha to ground us back to reality and give us something actually useful, and then wrap up with some Q&A. So this is going to be lightning fast, but hopefully useful, and we can obviously always people can watch it back and read the slides afterwards. So let's go. Let's see if this works. So none of this is new. Schema's not new. You all know the basics, but as we said, adoption sucked up till date because it's been complicated and difficult and abstract. One of the things that's really changed recently is that Google have started pushing much, much harder for people to adopt for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is that if they want to transform the conventional search results, the list of 10 blue links, into something like this slide, full of widgets, cards, and tools, and answers and experiences, they have to be able to do more than just scrape content. They have to understand that. And the mechanism they're using to gain that understanding is structured data and schema.org. Strategically for them, this is hugely important. It's the foundation for how they compete with Amazon, with Netflix, with all the people who are fighting for our time and attention and taking away money that they see as theirs, whether that's the launch of a new vertical like Google Flights or being able to buy things directly in the SERPs. They see this as their landscape. And in order to get there, they have to have structured data. However, Google aren't perfect, and sometimes not everybody agrees with their strategies and approaches, not least of which in the world of structured data, where quite often they come under fire for being perceived as stealing people's content, taking their clicks, and so on. And furthermore, schema.org is like a language, which means it's prone to the challenges of grammar and interpretation and inconsistencies and pronunciation, and these are all challenges that Google face with their interpretation of schema. It's unique. It's influenced by their processes, their politics, and their technology, and sometimes the details of where they get it right and wrong and have different opinions are quite valuable to understand, especially if we're setting the scene as Google maybe not being the only important consumer of schema. Let me give you some examples. So schema.org is a standard and it's defined. Yes, it's mostly run by Google, it's slightly awkward, but it should be an independent thing from Google's implementation of it. But for example, an article has to have an author and a publisher in order to be a valid article. However, in Google's rules, a publisher cannot be a person. But I have a blog. I publish content. I am the publisher of those articles. But as far as Google is concerned, that's an invalid schema, even though technically it is valid. Local businesses couldn't until recently have multiple opening hours within a single day, even though a lot of Europe takes a nap in the afternoon. There's no way to describe this. The logo of a publisher of a news article has different requirements if you're running AMP or if it's a different organization from the organization who publishes the website, except an organization can only have one logo in one format. It doesn't even work. Their interpretation is scattered, and there's lots of trial and error and fiddling and faffing to try and get it right because there's no documentation. It's radically inconsistent across and within Google, and the different teams who are responsible for different bits of rich snippets have different interpretations and standards and approaches. An article must have a main entity of page property, but FAQ markup must be the main entity of a page. It sounds very similar, but it's a polar opposite in approaches. Two different teams interpreting the rules in two radically different ways. Very, very challenging. The implication are that the way that they communicate around this, the kind of warnings and errors and issues they show in their tools aren't particularly helpful, they're not particularly consistent. People get confused when they think that the warnings that Google show mean they're doing something wrong, when it actually means that Google's interpretation of the standard isn't necessarily right. This is a bit of a mess. Also leads to all sorts of interesting technical opportunities, which I don't recommend doing, but it's worth noting that for quite some time, you could put HTML links in FAQ answer content. Now, why that's really interesting is two things. One is this is an affiliate link showing up directly within Google from somebody's schema, which is mind-blowing. But I think more interestingly, from a schema perspective, the data type for an answer to a question is text. And that is a strictly defined thing on schema.org, and it means what it says. The answer to this should support text. This is HTML markup. And when you read through Google's documentation and interpretation of these things, they have different definitions of what text means in different places. And the rules, again, are different for what text means in an article. You can have headers and paragraphs, but not line breaks, versus an FAQ answer where you can have links, but not headers. There is no logic or consistency to any of this. It's a mess. So that, I'll skip through some of this. One of the things I think it's really interesting to start thinking about if we start to open this kind of worms about schema beyond Google is that Google's whole paradigm, the way they think about the web, the way they think about links and content and entities, is that one page should be representing one thing. And that model has shaped the modern web as we know it. A web page has a URL and it talks about a thing because that's the keyword you want to rank for, it's what you want to be relevant for. I don't know if that's right. I don't know if it's the best way that we can build an internet. I struggle to conceive of other ways because this is so predominant, but it's not necessarily the best. This is their paradigm. And the way that they define how we have to approach schema, where every page has to have a main entity and we have to map out all the relationships between them, isn't necessarily the only way that it could be done. Which is why most of the content management systems and plugins and tools on the net are limited to something like this. This is why adoption has struggled. Because if I'm writing a page or a post, I can open up my tool and I can say, this page is an article, or it's about an event or a book. But that's only one aspect. What if I want to describe an article which I wrote, which is about an event, which is being held to the local business, which is a restaurant, which is a book signing by a local chef who's selling that book? Where is that option on the dropdown? Describing the world and its nuance in ways that unlock new possibilities and capabilities cannot be done in a model where one page is about one thing. To describe the world in a valuable and meaningful way, which allows us to get beyond Google, which I'll come on to, we need to be building a connected graph, not just bits of schema. The web is more than just pages. It's really hard to say this page contains an article which was written by a person who's an employee of an organization, yada, yada, yada. Martha's going to look at some of the practical implications of this, but I think this is really important. Google's model is simplistic, and it forces us to behave as if the web is simplistic, and we only produce and write the schema that gives us the immediate rewards that they're doling out. There is so much more that we can do with this when we get beyond what thing is on this page. Because what's really fascinating is that when you start to dig into some of the politics and processes behind the scenes, we're building these complex representations of our pages. Google do nothing with it. They don't actually parse and understand those relationships at any point. They just look through the strings of code and see if they can find an exact string match to the thing that that particular team is looking for. And then there's all sorts of nuance around how that works. They will only show your logo in search results if it's attached to an organization which has a certain directionality in the graph. And again, these are arbitrary decisions by teams, and they're shaping the very nature of the web in ways we ought to be aware of and consider, because it has profound implications on us as a society and an economy and beyond. One of the other challenges when we're stuck within a Google-specific world is that they don't support cross-page referencing. Now, part of the point, the very foundational point of linked to structured data, is to build and describe structures that span multiple pages and properties and websites and environments and toasters and TVs and formats. Google doesn't allow or support cross-referencing between pages. You cannot say, this article was written by the author represented on that URL. They have no mechanism to allow you to describe that. You've got to build the whole graph of everything you want to represent on a page on that page. This article was published by this organization, which is part of this website, which has this breadcrumb navigation, authored by this author, etc. All has to be on every page where you want to describe those relationships, which is particularly interesting when John Mueller comes out and says, only put your organization markup on the contact page. He's wrong. He's a smart guy and he's doing a great job, but this stuff is nuanced. That's because somebody hasn't given him, somebody from a specific team with an arbitrary interpretation of how schema.org works hasn't given him the right technical brief. We need to be describing these complex graphs on all of our pages. What I'm hinting at is, whilst I love Google and we work closely with them on a bunch of these standards and they're doing a great job and they're lovely people, there is room for more. Google's handling of schema is imperfect and, more interestingly, incomplete. They're only interested in the bits that they can reward in search results. That's the tip of the iceberg. But they exert a lot of influence over schema for their benefit. But schema.org is open source, which means that there's some stuff we can start to think about and do. Google's largest competitive advantage is that they can crawl and scrape and store and process data from the web at scale. In a world where more websites have more connected data and structure and describe their things, other brands, other platforms, and other products can start to intelligently extract and use that information at a fraction of the cost that Google does. That enables new search engines, new apps, new Internet of Things concepts, new machine learning capabilities. That's pretty exciting beyond just search results. It allows us to start to think about the internet as being units of things smaller than just pages, of components and blocks and paragraphs and entities. If a page contains 6 different things, that should be fine. But in Google's paradigm, it really isn't at the moment. We can start to break down the web to smaller units. And we can also start to think about what websites are and how they work in a world where the systems which are consuming data about that page might actually be more important than the human users who are coming and looking at the design and layout and reading the content. There'll be systems and APIs and integrations which can consume this information to power other systems and services, and they might be the primary consumers of websites. I'll get told off if I don't do a brief plug, but this is a lot of what I'm thinking about in my day job and how we start to mold WordPress and Yoast, etc., to support this. We've just launched a new API process where all of the information about a page, including the schema, is available in a REST API. This is consumable by machines without them having to download and fetch all of the fancy user-facing stuff on the front. That's pretty exciting. So, some practical starting points in 2 minutes or less. Go look at pending.schema.org. Martha's going to mention this. This is where all the upcoming stuff is documented. If you want to get ahead of the game and beat Google to defining how these things work, they have to react to how people are already consuming schema. If you have a business that operates in any of the sectors which look like they're being covered here, get there first and define the rules. You want to go further on defining the rules, contribute to and extend the spec. This is the schema.org GitHub repo. There is no specification for animals in schema. It's a continued running joke, but that's because there are no pet stores who've got there and defined it. That could be you. Martha's going to talk about custom properties and attributes. That's where you start. Somebody please do this. You want to get really clever, get some insight from the schema repo, go into that repository and search for Google. There are hundreds of tickets here started by Google employees where they're saying somebody from Google wants to be able to do the schema. This is your competitive roadmap for what your business should be exposing when it comes to structured data. You want to get really far beyond Google, become a consumer. If this stuff is structured and easy to consume and understand, there's no reason why your business and website and tools can't scrape and extract it in the same way, or maybe even better than Google can, maybe with some slightly better adherence to schema.org's rules. There are opportunities all sorts here. Going down, I'm going to shut up now because Martha's got much more interesting stuff to say, but go look through some of this, represent all the things on your site, and go out and win. Good luck. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a whirlwind tour, that was. That's great. Jono, if you can just check your mic. A couple of people saying you're just cutting out a little bit. I could hear you fine.
Oh, no, disaster.
But it come through fine to me. So, yeah, that was absolutely great. Even I learned a lot just listening to that. So
I love that. I especially loved the rail on the inconsistencies, because I do think that is a challenge. Like, we could talk for the rest of the half hour just about testing tools and the inconsistencies there. And I also loved the idea of, like, if you're thinking beyond the consumers, beyond Google, right, and thinking about sort of other things or understanding, there's a huge movement in AI and machine learning. This is sort of how understanding happens, right? Like, semantic technology and ontologies is like at the foundation of machine learning. So I think that's a great one. And then, get into GitHub. We have some great wins that we found for some of our clients by jumping into GitHub. So based on that foundation that John has given us, I'm actually going to give us some tactics into getting into sort of, how do you start connecting things on your site, and sort of what are some tactics that you can use. And I always start by sharing my knowledge graph, which is actually like how I'm connected to other things on the web and in the world. And I worked at Cisco for 14 years. I have a technical background. I'm one of the founders of Schema App. I'm Canadian. And I also used to own this awesome 1965 Austin Healey Sprite. And my actual car was in the movie Losing Chase, which was directed by Kevin Bacon. So through my car, I'm like 2 degrees from Kevin Bacon. And you wouldn't know that unless I explained how these things are connected. And so that really goes for your site and businesses or your blogs as well, right? You can use the schema markup to explain how things are connected, how they relate to one another, whether that be sort of within your own site, in your own business, or sort of outside of the web, and on different entities. I'm a big believer in like not putting the same schema markup on every page, because you want to explain like what that exact page is. And instead, what you want to do is try to use that most specific type from schema.org. And schema.org has like over 800 different types. So someone's always like, well, I can't describe it. You can describe an animal. It's just like using some advanced techniques. But yeah, animal is a really great example of where there's a void. I also love that like in local business, there's no marketing agency or SEO agency, when like, in fact, we're the ones that are all, like you're the ones that are all trying to apply this, but you always want to use the most specific type from schema.org. And you don't want to create islands of schema markup. Previously, I was talking about like not chasing features, but instead like thinking about what is on this page, how are those connected, and how does that then connect across the business? And I'll endeavor in the next 10 minutes to give you some tips on how to do that. One of the key things is around nesting markup. within the primary topic of the page. And what this means is actually like figuring out how they're connected. And so there's actually a free tool on our website called Schema Paths. You can find it under resources, tools, Schema Paths, or just Google Schema Paths. And this was created by my co-founder because like he got really tired of trying to figure out how to nest and relate things. And so, you know, for example, if you had a local business page that was talking about the local business and also included some FAQ on the page, and you want to figure out how to do this connectedness, how do you take step one to nest them, we would actually tell you, okay, for if your local business is the primary topic of the page, you can use subject of and then add FAQ page and nest it. Or if the page is primarily about the FAQ page and you want to link it back to the local business, you can use a property about. And you can really use this to connect anything. I always love the fact that there's a volcano in schema.org and gas station, and boom, bada bing, you can use schema paths and say that if it's primarily talking about the volcano on the page, you could say it contains a gas station. That would be quite explosive. Or, the gas station serves an area that includes the volcano. And so I really encourage you, if you're trying to do this more connected, nested schema markup, Schema Paths, great free tool, kind of help you do that. The other piece I think that's really key is how do we start like connecting things and defining things beyond sort of our own definition. So if we sort of define them within our own business, that's great. But there's things like Wikidata, Wikipedia, and Google's Knowledge Graph that already defines a lot of these entities. And so, Baker Street Station is one of my favorite gastropubs in town. An example of how you can start using Wikipedia or Wikidata or Google's Knowledge Graph is on properties such as like areas served. So they serve Guelph, which is the city I live in. Guelph is, I don't have to define it because it's already defined in Wikipedia. Or Wikidata we like is even more specific because it sort of takes a language piece out of it. Additional type is an interesting one. So this is a pub, but in essence, it's a gastropub. So it's like all about food in addition to the beer. And so additional type's one of these properties within schema.org that advanced users can use to clarify the type. So it's a bar or pub with additional type gastropub, which is defined in Wikipedia. So I can be really, really specific about the type of pub that I'm in. The other piece is you want to make sure you're using strong connectors. And there's like properties within different schema.org types that allow you to do this to make things really connected. I really love like about, mention, subject of, and has part. And so, this is a news article about the Some Good News show that was bringing us all kinds of joy at the beginning of COVID. And it mentions John Krasinski. And John Krasinski is the same as the Wikipedia definition of John Krasinski. So you can see sort of like as you can, start connecting and explaining how these things are all connected. And then, of course, like within the schema markup, instead of having multiple entities, they're all nicely connected and define exactly what it is. And you can do this like ad nauseum. One of my favorites is, FAQ with features within Google. You can also figure out how to nest them so that pages that might not get a rich result, you can actually start getting rich results for if you can update that content. One of my favorites is around organizations. We don't have like social and other sort of features that used to exist. So, why not add an FAQ to that page, be able to get a rich result, again, beautifully nested and saying, oh, it's an FAQ page maybe about the organization, or, the bar or pub has this FAQ. Now, one of the things I wanted to jump in on is, schema.org has these extensions. And so Jono, I thought, had a great sort of action, get involved and kind of get into the details of things. So one of the extensions that we use extensively at Schema App for our health-related clients is the Health and Life Sciences extension. There's also automotive, bibliographic, and others that are constantly in development. And these are sort of, I'll say, like, groups of communities that are developing them. And they're often either sort of internal extensions on schema.org. So FIBO, which was finance, actually got rolled directly into schema.org, whereas some of the others still remain sort of an extension of schema.org. What we want to do here is look at like, these are very specific types of schema markup for a specific industry. And so here I've just given you examples of like the types that exist within health and life sciences, but also types that are also just in schema.org that may be used by health and life sciences, such as like a product, a news article, an FAQ, et cetera. Now, when someone does a search, the reason I like looking at this is like when you look at the search and you think about how are we going to figure out like the connected things that would allow us to answer the question of a Lyme doctor in Toronto. And I have Lyme disease, so I always use this as my example. And so, it's actually a medical condition, a physician, and an area served. And so if you were a hospital, your hospital might be part of like a larger organization. So you would have like your parent organization that you define there. And then the hospital has all these different properties. Now, there's many, 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 many of them. The question here are like, what are the ones that will help you best define not just what the hospital page is talking about, right? Because the guidance on like only optimize what's visible on the page, but also that makes it really clear or defines how it's connected to other things. So don't take it as a, challenge to use all the properties, but know that they're there in order to help you explain things appropriately beyond the features in Google. And so here the hospital, has maybe medical specialties that it treats, including that could be defined as Lyme disease. It has their contact points, could define the area served. Oh, this could be beautiful wiki definition here, and then I connect it all together. And so here you can see we're already saying, okay, well, the hospital treats Lyme. It's located in Toronto, but I now need to kind of figure out how like a physician would be connected. And so again, you could look at medical specialty and look at that sort of backwards relatedness using schema paths. Or you could also look at physician, and I happen to know that physician also defines medical specialty. And so now I have the doctor that, is also could be connected to the hospital. There's a hospital affiliate property, specifically does Lyme. And now we can answer the question. We can know that the medical condition, physician, and area served. And the reason I use this example is that, here is, a very realistic, company, hospital network that is trying to make sure that people know sort of what they serve. And these aren't necessarily the primary things or features that exist within Google. Now, we tend to like to look at describing what are the things within the business and then looking for ways to, basically, use those rich results or sort of those features sort of within it. So if it's a doctor, let's look at a rating. If it's a hospital, let's look at an FAQ, if we're describing these different things. But more importantly, know that whatever your business is, you can actually use schema.org to explain what it is and how it relates to others, and then look at ways that you can maximize the features within Google. And I often talk about this as like the starting point of doing your schema markup strategy. It isn't necessarily about what features you can get, but what is it within the business you need to be understood and explained? And then how do you optimize that? Connect it to other pieces, and then really think about the content on the page in order to maximize features. So I am the CEO at Schema App. And for those of you that don't know, Schema App has a schema markup solution that works with all websites, all content, without an IT developer. And so we work with companies like SAP, Keen Footwear, Advent Health, and we have all of the vocabulary, all of the properties, and allow you to do any basic, advanced, nested, connected, you name it, within the tools. We also are really passionate about sharing learning. And so if you want to kind of get our regular updates on what's going on, you can sign up in our newsletter or take an email course to learn more about schema markup. And most importantly, under resources where I highlight the schema paths, I mentioned about really getting into like that schema markup strategy or our FAQ webinar. There's a ton of just free resources, not even gated, just like there to really help you educate and kind of take a journey to build this work. So those are the tactics I had to share in order to kind of set up our conversation to say, like, how do you think really about sort of schema markup beyond just the feature, but really about explaining your business and sort of understanding how it's all related?
That's it. That was great. Yeah, and that's the bit that I love, is the way that you can connect all of the dots together. I call it connecting the dots. And it is the fact that you're able to send a much richer and a much deeper understanding of what that specific bit is that you're trying to explain, whether it's about the business or whether it's about the elements on the page of what you're talking about. So yeah, that's great. We've got lots and lots of questions in the chat here, which I was expecting to be there.
We're ready.
So yeah. So let's get off and running here. Let's see what we've got here. Right. So the first one is from our friend Simon Cox. Other than plugins, what is the easiest way to write schema? So, other than plugins.
Do you want to take this, Martha? I think we're aligned on this, aren't we?
Sure. Well, I think we a friend of ours recently tweeted and said, I spent all day Saturday writing schema markup, and Jono and I were like, I don't know about you, but like I was out playing with my kids. So, like you can learn how to do it. And I think reading it's good. In fact, Google has like a code lab, like to help you make sure you understand it. But, I would say like generate your schema markup and then look to edit it and learn it. And so whether you're using a free generator, I tend to like Merkel's generator, I think is really good. Or, you can, if there's depending on the type of site you have, there are plugins like, Yoast that will sort of serve you if you have primarily, articles, FAQs and things that they serve. But then again, if you're looking to sort of do things that are more advanced, again, like I would encourage you to find something to generate. We're like a database hosted solution, so you can actually create your schema markup, go and edit it anytime across any piece. But if you want to learn it, like the best is to just try to practice it. I would start with a free generator and try to kind of backwards engineer how it's done. But more people will tell you in schema markup, like they spent hours trying to figure out where the missing comma or quote is, or like how to, especially nested schema markup, like it can get pretty confusing as to like where to put it. So I would say, yeah, you can learn it, but I would say, start with sort of generators to kind of get a sense of what it is, because your time is much better spent strategizing on how you want to represent your content and nest it and figure it out, rather than write it. But that's, that's from those of us that have been generating it since, the 2012s, 2013. It's just, really, it's a, do you want to spend the time doing that?
I think this is really important. I see so many people talking about things like, we're using Google Tag Manager to write our own schema. If you're just doing that on one page for one very specific scenario, for one type of rich result you want, great, go and do it. But when you're starting to do more complex and structured descriptions, the type of things you reference, it gets really hard, and it's going to be maintained over time.
Yeah, so fragile. It becomes really fragile and brittle, right?
Yeah, the author of one of your posts gets married and changes her name. Now, all of your schema, where every time, like it just, bits fall apart. You need a system behind it all powering it. Otherwise, it just collapses.
The other piece we see is like if there's lots of cooks in the kitchen, even just changing the structure of the page, if you're doing it and using XPaths and so forth to define it, it can just become really brittle. So pros and cons, it just depends on the size of site you're working on, how much time you want to spend on it, budget and resource.
Let's say, I do a lot of stuff with structured data via GTM, and like I say to people, it is fragile. And you've only got to have a web design change or a CSS class change, and then it just breaks. So if you're in safe hands, then you're halfway there. I think it's a word for it. Right, the next one is from Dwayne Diesel, I think is how you pronounce it. Nothing against Schema app, but WordLift is the most.
It's like shameless marketing during the Semrush thing. Yeah.
Let's see. Plugin to use for WordPress. Why above and beyond anything?
Okay, you have to let me respond to that, Paul.
Okay,
so Jono, why don't you hit the WordPress piece and then I'll hit the rest.
That's it.
So if you're running WordPress and you're running any SEO plugin other than Yoast, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Not just from the schema, but mostly from the schema. Like the stuff we output is so much more sophisticated than anything else out there. Now, WordLift are great. They've got some really smart approaches. It's a very different approach, a much more centralized, kind of them trying to own the schema. It's interesting. I think it has some valid value. But if you're talking about WordPress land, it's Yoast or nothing.
All right. And I'll build on that by saying, thank you for the call out for Schema app. But, when Jono's Yoast plugin, doesn't do it justice and you need sort of more flexibility or more authoring. Like we have a WordPress plugin that also connects to our application. So you can easily create schema markup, robust schema markup, and also manage it centrally, right? So especially for agencies that are trying to do schema markup across 20 different sites and want to be able to make an update in literally 20 seconds and not have to talk to a developer, not like manage things with the business owner, and actually, really take, capture that opportunity. With COVID-19, like we had schema markup for special announcement. Both COVID-19, the special announcement was in Schema app within 24 hours, and we had it on all of our hospital networks within like 48. And so like that flexibility, but also maintenance. And then we do it at scale, right? Again, entity linking we see as being important. In fact, we're about to make an announcement on like how you do kind of semantic linking with Wikipedia and knowledge graphs automatically, like at scale. Although we do that today sort of within the app. I see WordLift as like they think of a lot of the 5-star linking as a starting point, then schema markup as like a secondary piece. I think Jono, you and I both like see schema markup as like its own thing that's really core. So it really depends on your approach, the problem you're trying to solve. I do think we all sort of have our strengths and play in different markets.
That's it. And whilst we're on the subject of WordPress, Fresh Products has got a question. For Jono, do WordPress plugins like Schema app and WordLift cause any known conflicts with Yoast? As in, I suppose the point is, if you've got more than one schema plugin, so to say, active on there, does it cause any issues, or does it just
some of them do. They can all be made to play together nicely, like I touched on IDs briefly. If you're merging references into each other, that works fine. So you might have, I don't know, the Yoast plugin saying, here's an FAQ page in the FAQs, and then something else entirely saying, and here is an automobile dealer. As long as they cross-reference the correct IDs correctly, then that'll stitch beautifully. However, that's hard. That's hard to implement. It's hard to maintain. So yeah, some of the basic stuff will work absolutely fine. But if you're running 3 different schema solutions, you've probably got other problems.
Yeah. So, Jono, we've actually, made sure that we had a check mark to remove your schema markup for a long time, and sort of, we actually are big fans of your SEO plugin and use it on our own site. But we tend to use Schema app for our schema markup. So we've actually built ours to be very compatible with Yoast, just because that's important. And I'll take an action item on the add ID just to double check that we've gone that far, sort of in that integration. Yep.
Awesome.
That's it, right? So Jeff Kennedy, do you foresee any shifting? Google shifting their approach anytime soon, i.e. taking a more holistic view, obviously, on schema?
No, I think so. I've spoken to various teams working on various parts of this, and some of them are like they differ radically in ideology, in approach, etc. One of the things I've trained myself to do, and we're trying to do internally, is to stop thinking about Google as a monolithic organization, and to remember that it is bunches of small teams and operates much more like a university of project groups experimenting with ideas. And I think culturally that's not going to change anytime soon. Sometimes there's obviously a directive from on high which gives them direction, but these bits don't talk to each other, at least not very well.
Yeah, I agree with you, Jono, my interactions with them as well, that we're seeing sort of a really different range, which also means that like when you see something weird happen over here, you have to understand like that it's not always applies across the board. And I always use this example, like if John Mueller says something, he's saying it sort of within his area of knowledge, but might not sort of understand it sort of on a broader state. And my favorite one was like support for Google Tag Manager in Schema Markup, which like they've now actually documented.
Yes, no.
Like we've been doing it for a long time successfully, and are talking to a lot of teams around adoption for Schema Markup, at Google, who want everyone to adopt it, right? So I think that's just like take news that you get from different spokespeople, with a grain of salt. I think the piece of where do we think it's going, I think is a very interesting question. And Johnny, in your presentation, you mentioned like different consumers of Schema Markup, and and structured data, and the fact that we're going to start to see sort of more consumers. So voice assistants was sort of the big announcement that they make last May, like May 2019, where they're like, oh, we're going to consume the Schema Markup to answer questions in voice. And, lo and behold, how-to and FAQ came out to support that, because that makes absolute total sense. We're now seeing on the media side, like that image meta tag kind of licensing piece come out that was announced. And, what's interesting there is that like now they're introducing this whole like licensing element, right? So we know, especially in Europe, GDPR is coming down hard on Google on, how are they reusing information and making money off of it. So if you kind of connect all those dots together, it's sort of like, at what point does the website primarily become the container for explaining content for different machines to consume, that we then choose which machines we're going to use in order to interact with that data? And I think voice is such a great example, and it also voice also really evens the playing field. Like my 5 and 7-year-old ask Google questions on voice. Amazon is playing in voice and sort of are looking at sort of taking on the product space. You start seeing like Facebook is sort of, all done their open graph, but like they're trying to consume and understand content. Microsoft is another kind of player in this space, Apple. So to me, like that's the kind of interesting shift. I just don't think it's going to happen as fast as we expect. In 2014, 2015, I was hoping like Schema Markup was going to be like the big next thing, and it's taken till 2020. But I really see that where it's going. And so I think Google is going to start to be disrupted. And, a lot of it's driving sort of how do they make money on ads? And so how is that going to evolve?
I've been waiting, for exactly the same kind of moment. I think I've started to see enough of it. One of the things that happened, a couple of months ago, that went somewhat under the radar is, you mentioned Facebook. Facebook and Google. Facebook Catalog and Google Merchant Center, or vice versa, whichever one's which,
absolutely.
are both now able to read schema about products off your webpage and automatically update your inventory. So rather than have to produce a big old XML feed and pipe it to Facebook to say I've sold 3 widgets, they come to you, they pass the schema, and your website is now the single source of truth for more than just your users. Now you're feeding these systems. That's Facebook and Google as of now. There's a slight challenge that there still isn't a good way of describing variant products and schema. There's an open ticket on the GitHub repository for them trying to work out how the heck they do it. There's no way to do it, but that's happening. Also, you mentioned kind of consumer decisions in where and how we consume content. There's a huge amount of focus going on with editorial trust. And when you start looking around some of the stuff from the Trust Project going back as far as 2017, there's a bunch of schema around saying that news organizations ought to be using schema to say, here is my diversity policy. Here is my information on how we're funded. Here is the biographies of our editors, that sort of information, which then they and other people can use to say, is this a trustworthy publication? Not just about web pages and the website, but the organization itself. I think that's huge.
And that all comes back to like using schema markup to tell like your connected story, right? And I think like in my one of my favorite presentations from Status Search, what I presented in 2017 was like manage your brand's knowledge graph. And you know, to me, like I do think that that's where we're going. But from a marketer's perspective, it's understanding this machine layer, right? So that there's this very much indeed this marketing data layer that needs to exist and be managed, and especially you know if done right can also be reused. And that's maybe a whole other conversation for how you use it to do inferencing, but that's like an area we're really passionate at Schema App because you know because we build the knowledge graphs, we can export them then reuse them, especially in enterprise. It becomes really interesting.
Yeah, go ahead. I'll let you finish.
So you mentioned like the connection to business strategy and working out what properties you have and how you represent them. I think the opposite's a really interesting approach as well, where you go, you know what, where don't we have properties? And if we're trying to say, okay, Google needs us to be authoritative and expert and whatever else, shouldn't we list which universities our writers went to? And it becomes apparent that actually you outsource all of your content cheaply. Then you've identified a business problem that you need to solve before you can then reap the benefits of the schema. And like, there's a strategy. That's right.
Yeah. Well, and the same goes from like just backwards engineering your content, looking at what, you know, what is Google talking about in GitHub around sort of this new area, and how do you just use that as a way, you know, someone I think asked around like, you know, there's all these different classes and all these different types and all these properties, you know, there's a reason why when they defined this in 2011, they explained these different pieces. The question then is for you to interpret that and what makes sense for your business and your users. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the next question I was going to roll straight onto.
All right, go for it. We'll dig into it some more.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and you've been doing a great job so far, and it blends straight in with what you guys were just talking about, which is how far is too far with over 800 different types of schema. That's it up on the screen here. Nice. Which ones do you choose from? Which are applicable, or are there only a few? So, yeah, how far is too far with markup?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, you go.
So I actually think it's a business question to start, which is, you know, like, how do you represent what's important for people to understand about your business and the content that exists today to do that? And then you want to ask the question, which is like that backwards engineering piece of like, you know, what makes most sense to add to your content to help you further define and explain, you know, what it is and how it is. Again, always with the intent of providing service to those users, right? And so, you know, you don't want to, you know, we often say like, don't use like the Schema app, you know, editor forms like as a challenge to fill out every property. Like we don't want to do that, but they're there to help you represent what's important to your users in your business and to prompt ideas on what you might want to put on there. So I would say is like, you know, and I kind of refer to that resource of like how to do a schema markup strategy. It really is like, what are the important things about your business? You know, where do they exist on the web? You know, what are, you know, and then it's just like, you know, pulling in that content piece and like, can I get a rich result for that? You know, and how do I then sort of tie all those things together? So I would say like, you know, the different types really relate to your business, right? Like if you're a hospital, like I was showing to you, you're going to use way different schema markup types and properties than if you're an e-commerce business, right? So it really just, you know, depends on what you're doing, but you want to make sure it's absolutely clear. You're trying to answer that, what is the searcher's intent? And then if you're a futurist like me, you want to be thinking about like, where is that searcher also maybe going for service like voice or other places that might have other questions that relate to that topic?
I was just thinking back to your example of, I'm on this side, not that side.
Oh,
thinking about your example of positions as well. Like you probably wouldn't want to describe the height and weight of that position. You could, add a huge amount of value. But also that changes over time. So there's a maintenance overhead in some cases where you start to go overboard. And that's one of the key business questions is, can we support and maintain all of this? Because if you're outputting tons of stuff that's now stale, that can't be a good signal, right?
Well, and it comes to data architecture too, but that's again another, how do you kind of think consistently? That's both logical for machines and humans.
That's another 30 hours.
The physicians one is interesting though, because like seeing where they're the alumni of might be interesting because that then might be authoritative, right? So if you're not listing, maybe where they did their residency, where they did, all their different postdocs, et cetera, that may be something to add.
That's it, yeah. And I think that helps roll on to the next one for Vivian. Can you add two different types of markup on a single URL? And I think we've sort of like gone over that with the nesting issue. So I don't know if any of you just want to...
Well, I think the only other example I would say is like breadcrumb, right? So breadcrumb can be its own entity, and then you have like the entity more about the topic. So, there are exceptions to the rule. However, like I think you want to try to explain it. And often I say like, if you have 5 entities, like you can use main entity of page to say which one it's primarily about. But in most part, like anytime I look at a site, I think I was looking at one of the big publishers in the US, and I was just like, why are they like have like video and they have events and they have article, and it's like, seriously, this page is an article that is the subject of this video, and part of it I think is just laziness when people like don't think it or sort of they don't understand sort of how they're supposed to represent that, and I think a lot of it's feature hunting really, and the
structured data nesting tool has somewhat rewarded this behavior, right? Because it goes, oh look, I've got 5 different things, and you think, great, rather than I've got one cohesive description of all the relationships.
And that relationships piece, like to kind of go back to Google, like Google is a knowledge graph, right? Like they're, like let's put on our, for those of us that are semantic technologists, I understand it. Like it's about connecting things on the web and understanding those relationships to answer questions. And so, while today, they're mostly, different teams are looking at different elements of that holistically as an engine. They do want to see how that's done. And so I think that's the power, especially if you get this right. There's going to be a lot of reuse and kind of power and sort of truly having that graph and how things are connected.
That's it. That's perfect. Yeah. So another question from our friend Dwayne Diesel, not about Schema Wrap this time. What is the most... what are the drawbacks of being ambiguous when applying schema or other structured data? Like, what is the worst that could happen?
So, ambiguity is interesting. So if you falsify stuff outright, you're obviously at risk of Google slapping you and saying you're no longer eligible for X types of schema or any kind of structured data. But there's definitely, an interesting middle ground for ambiguous stuff. So I guess you could make vague statements and claims and not quite define things, but then you're not going to achieve anything unless you're sending strong signals about this is about that and is the main entity of this thing and they're related in this way. Then it's just going to be code on a page, right? It's not going to describe things accurately. Like the whole point here is we're trying to send explicit signals.
Exactly. So that last line that Jono just said, like you're trying to be very clear about this. So, if you're being ambiguous, I would say why, and are you actually providing, are you doing a service to your users or yourself? It sounds like probably you should just go drink coffee instead of writing that schema.
So another one from Dwayne. He's told us it's his last question. So, is there any point of using other ontologies? I think you can pronounce it.
Ontologies, yeah.
That's it, yeah. Like OWL, like OWL, or FOAF. So I don't know if you've heard of those. I certainly haven't.
I know what OWL is.
Do you want to say this?
Yeah, do you want me to talk about it? So, so what Dwayne is talking about is sort of the underlying ontology technologies, right? So, the thing I always like to start as a beginning is like when you're actually using schema markup, you're actually building what we call triples, and sort of a triple is defining, So I always use the name is Martha Van Berkel, right? And then you could also be like, Martha Van Berkel is a girl, and then all of a sudden you can infer that, different things between, or girls can have babies. So then Martha Van Berkel can have a baby, right? So when you define your schema markup and you're using the subject and predicate and so, noun or thing, you're actually describing how these things are related. And the reason I bring that up is when you talk about OWL or other ontologies or turtle and like other kind of ways of using an ontology, you're actually saying like, how do you break down and use those triples in different ways? And so, really when you're thinking about building your schema markup, just think about like how you're refining those things. Now, is there any point in using other ontologies? We're like my co-founder Mark, who's like the semantic technologist, like he would say like schema.org is a pretty robust vocabulary that describes a lot of different things. And there's even, sort of the different kind of, I'll say externally hosted ontologies that describe local businesses and so forth. But part of me is like, well, why wouldn't you just like link to Wikipedia for a definition, which is again, like a known dictionary that's not hosted by someone else, that then is sort of a dependency on them being managed. So I would say like, there's enough robustness like within schema.org that unless you're actually starting to build an ontology for an enterprise that needs to be extended maybe with like an internally hosted ontology that has specific definitions. When like in technology, I grew up at Cisco, like there's not really good definition for technical bugs and sort of things within technology within schema.org. And so that might be an area that it makes sense to do an externally hosted ontology and then link to it. But I'd say for the most part, no one needs to do that.
That's great. So yeah, another question from Jeff Kennedy. How would we make a business case for a site to implement schema beyond what is supported by Google? So like we're saying, going much deeper into schema.org other than what Google specifies on their developer guidelines.
I would, because Google is not the only search engine, because what they support will change tomorrow, and you absolutely want to beat your competitors to whatever shiny new rich results are coming. And increasingly, even outside of Google, Facebook, Bing, etc., voice is a thing. Your toaster is connected to the internet. Your TV will read structured data to determine what to show you. Netflix will, this is the new way that systems harvest data to market to you, to understand you, to connect and solve information. And if your brand is either hoarding that or not exposing it, these services aren't going to be able to use it to recommend you. And increasingly, like Google is so far ahead on this. When you search and you see a list of cards and rich snippets and results, they are only selecting and exposing those from brands which they've understood, from content they've understood. And if you're not marking yours up in a way that they can understand, you never get in front of the consumer in the first place. So it doesn't matter how good you're competing elsewhere, you can't access the market. This is the tool.
Yeah. So I think also it's like you want to describe like how things are connected, but in my experience with all of our customers, like, and we do SMB all the way through enterprise, it does help tell your story if you can get some rich results in that first kind of test bed. And so again, like FAQ is a really great one that you can use sort of across different pieces. But it is like, kind of, what is it? The tide rises all boats kind of thing, where, like identify what you can get rich results for, because that's going to give a visual way to influence and show sort of how change. And then the metrics are going to support it. Google, like within Search Console, is very clear on sort of like how those rich results, really move things forward and help you tell that story. And then you can sort of look at sort of the broader impact across your other metrics. But in sort of proving business cases and so forth, I do say like, as you build that business case, like start with a segment that is both important to the business and that also you may have some flexibility to do some rich results because it's easier to influence. And on Schema app, like under resources, like there's 16 benefits of schema markup, and the ones Jono mentioned and others with data, and then case studies are there to sort of help you make that case.
That's it. And then there's a quick one for you here, Martha, which is from Olympia Creswell. Do you have pricing for web design agencies? My clients are 99% local businesses. I mean, schema app pricing. So I'll let you pick up.
Oh, I love those kind of questions. So, so we have an offering that allows you to do like one website and then multi-type websites. So we have like 10 websites for $100 a month, and and then we have everything from at scale. So kind of our pricing then goes up sort of depending on what it is. One thing that's really different about Schema is like we have expert support. So like if you have a question about like schema markup strategy or how to use the tools or how to sort of like nest things, you'll get a 30-minute free onboarding call from us, and then ability to email us as many times as you want to ask questions to clarify. And then we do have a new partner program that provides incentives for partners to be able to use our whole range of tools.
That's it. We've got another question there from Franco Valentino. Can you explain how to use schema in a graph format easily? I know Yoast picks up on that very well.
Yeah, that's a fun one. So what do we mean by graph format?
That was going to be my question.
We were saying just now that a lot of the problems that the big publishers and sites have is that they output 5 bits of schema when you have an event, a video, an article, and they're not related. And there are a bunch of reasons why they do this. As you said, they might be lazy, they might not understand, etc. It is hard to interconnect all of those. And traditionally, the way you would do that is try and construct a tree structure. So you say, which is the main thing, and then what are the relationships, and then describe that big flow down. That's really hard to design. It's really hard to implement. If you change the structure of your JSON LD and you wrap it all within a graph attribute, you can look at Yoast.com in the source code and see this. You can describe each individual piece on that page individually at the top level without needing a big tree, and then just define the relationships between the IDs. So you don't need to architect this kind of big cascading solution. You just need to define the relationships between the things, and then Google, etc., when they pass it, will work out that big hierarchy. It's much easier for managing bits with lots of moving parts and integrations.
So, and Schema App does that sort of by native, like within a project. So within one site, we build a graph automatically through everything. So as you identify entities, you can relink to them, refine them, and sort of we'll actually produce that graph. So part of it doesn't require that developer and allows you to just like start thinking about, oh, it's an author. I've already defined that author. I can then just like pull in that reusable entity. And so that's part of like, again, as a semantic technology company under the ground, like every website schema markup is a graph by nature of how we operate.
Yes, yeah. No, I like using the graph. It's a great format. It helps definitely join the dots together. So we've got another question from Byron Bloom. Where do you think Google will land for rich results for reviews? Because obviously towards the end of last year, Google removed them. Well, they didn't remove them, but they started to ignore them so much within organization, local business.
Yes. This is one of my, Brian. Hi, Brian. How are you doing? Brian, I know Brian. So I can start with this, and Jono, you can chime in. So what's interesting is even weeks after we saw that change, it was September 2019, we actually saw Google start rewarding ratings on physicians, which are a type of local business. And then we also saw that sort of linking coming into the knowledge graph. So we do know that, the whole motivation there was around like trust, right? And so, for physicians, they actually have to follow a ton of policies, and there's a lot of, I'll say like paperwork and sort of policy as to who can collect ratings or not. So I think part of it is they're going to try to just figure out, how do they make sure it's not spammy and adding value? The piece that I cried a little bit about was like when they made that rating change, they also took it away from blogs and articles, which I thought was actually very powerful to help us understand, which blogs were good and which ones we should go to. So I thought that is, but I think we'll hopefully see them sort of ease back on it. Part of it is like, how do they do that? Is it sort of, you still have to collect them on Google My Business for local business or somewhere else hosted where there's a valid user, and then you can relate to a third party. The recommendations got recently updated to say you couldn't link to a third party, which was a new ad. So I think we're still to see, but I guess I tell that physician story because like they are watching and listening and understanding to where like they can trust. And so I think that's where we'll see the evolution.
It's such a mess, this one, isn't it? It feels like this is another one that somebody's dropped the ball between the spam team and the schema team responsible for it. Like, what does self-serving mean? Because I run a website designed to sell the things I sell. That's like, where do you draw the line on that definition? And then the distinction between reviews of my business versus a product I sell. But what if I'm a service business where that doesn't make sense?
It's really tough. Yeah.
Yeah, and then the inability to reference or embed third-party reviews
I know.
like Trustpilot seems absolutely at odds with the intent of this. If the idea is, okay, you can't represent your own trustworthiness, but third parties can.
It's like
that's
we might
exactly
as well
what the system could do.
Or we might as well just like pay all the like hosted sites, right? Like the Yelps and the Capteras
who
and so
they
forth,
don't want
right?
to write. Yeah, like another part of Google is like death to affiliates because you're a thin middleware and you don't add any value, yet you're the only source of trust. That seems completely ideologically broken. Yeah. This is bits of Google not working out how Google works, I think. And then we just have to deal with it.
Very circular back to like, the right hand's not talking to the left hand. And, but I guess I have hope because I saw some changes. And so I think over time we'll see that. I don't like that it's sort of pointing everyone to send their customers to other party sites that sometimes you have to pay. That to me doesn't seem logical.
But then
yeah, it definitely. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, all I was going to say is you have to remember as well is that within Google Ads, they pull the reviews in from those third-party sites like Trustpilot, some others that are being mentioned. So, like
totally.
I say, one hand isn't listening to the other.
Well, and we have to always go back to Google's motivation, right? Like they're a business trying to make money. And so, even I think some of the behaviors go back to like, what is in their best interest. And a lot of what we're seeing is that. On that happy note.
Yeah, that's it. And we're at the top of the hour.
Nice.
So yeah, anyone else that's got any further questions, please do reach out to any of us via any of our social profiles, and I'm sure we'll pick up on those in no time at all. It's been absolutely great having the opportunity to sit with both of you guys and talk through this. It'd be great to do some more. We'll pick up on that afterwards. Maybe go a little bit more in depth into something in very specific, a specific niche like medical or e-commerce.
Absolutely. Anytime.
So yeah, we'll pick up on that afterwards. So hopefully everyone listening, you'll hear about that very soon. And yeah, if you guys would like to just give like just 2 quick tips, which is probably really hard on this subject, just for the audience to, whether to go and learn somewhere or where there's a good tool apart from your own to go and look at.
Well, I'll call it Schema Paths, which I already mentioned.
Yeah.
It's a free tool on our website, but it helps you starting to think about that connectedness. And I think, if anything, it'll allow advanced users to start to figure out how to use some of those maybe unknown properties to figure out sort of how things are there. And then I would say sort of, as you're building a business case or trying to get started or sort of playing with nesting, I really like FAQ. And we actually, we shared our webinar like with a ton of content and examples of how you can do that on product organization, you name it. So those, I guess, would be like 2 learning pieces that I think are really valuable and help you get started on this journey.
Enjoy.
Nice. Mine would be go and read through the schema.org page that lists all of them. There's just some really fascinating stuff in there. And there's in particular, outside of like the very obvious stuff, there's a whole section of intangible things like mathematical calculations and data sets and ideas. All of these are things that can be represented. And again, only do it if you can find the business case, but have an awareness of what's possible, because that's pretty awesome. The other suggestion would be think about what goes into an average web page. So there's loads of cool stuff you can do with FAQ pages and e-commerce, but just a normal web page is a web page that maybe contains an article that was published by an organization, that has an author, that has a logo, that has a width in pixels and a MIME type that's served in these URLs. And like, there is so much depth and richness you can use to describe just an average web page. And that's a really fun way of learning, like, how many things can I describe on this? This thing has a description, it has a name, it has a sign. Like, that's really awesome. Play there.
I think we should do another seminar where we like dork out on GitHub in schema.org.
Just cherry picking the fun stuff. Yeah, definitely.
We'd have to get Mark in here, though. He'd want to play on that one.
That'd be cool.
That's it, yeah. That's super. Well, thank you for Semrush for letting us do this. And yeah,
thank you.
If there's any questions, anyone watching, then just please do reach out.
Good luck. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you later.